Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Cultural Perspective. As we all know, in this module I am talking about historicizing disability, and we are going to talk today the last lecture of this module, that is Rethinking Monstrosity in India. So before I come to discuss what is rethinking monstrosity in India and what are the points I am going to cover it up, let me go back and talk about certain points that we have already covered. So the first important point that we made is, since India is a very diverse country in terms of culture and other things, it's not easy to tap or bring one thinking, one understanding of disability in India. Second, we discussed that how the different context has a different meaning associated with disabilities. Third, as we noticed that as the time proceeded, the meaning associated with disability also evolved. It did not remain static, it did not remain monolithic. So as we saw in the Buddhism, there is a different thinking. As after the colonial intervention, we discussed that due to the colonial intervention, people with disabilities got segregated, they were hospitalized, they were treated as if they are unwanted in the society. Before that, there was some different kind of a treatment, but they were very much part of the integration. I also discussed what Usha Bhatt has to say about Mahabharata, Manusmriti and other things, like how disability is projected in those texts. But we also looked at that how these texts are not prescriptive as Bible is, but rather these texts are more as interpretive. You can interpret, their instructional text. So all those characters which we have must be read in the context. I also alarmed you that when you are reading them, think about it, what is the time period in which these texts were written, what are the kind of character they have, what are the other character we have, and also that we are not supposed to just pick up one isolated event and analyze that, but rather we have to look at other event, other context, and then we see how we can interpret the characteristics of a person, right? So these are the things that we tried to discuss, and we talked about history of disability in India, how it evolved, how people interpret it, how people read it, how people think about it, right? So this is what we were trying to look at it. These were points which we wanted you to discuss more. And also when we in the end of the lecture number 14, I was talking about that how we need to go for the folklores, historical records, archives, to know more about disability in India, because it's really complex to trace the history of disability in India. But I just told you how to do it. I mean, what are the things that we need to be cautious about? What are the things that we are supposed to be aware before we delve into disability studies? So, before I go into rethinking monstrosity in India, you must be thinking that why I am talking about monstrosity. Suddenly, what disability has to do with the monstrosity? It has to do because people with disability were treated as if they were monsters, as if they are a threat to the society, as if they are kind of creating a danger, they are dangerous individuals for the society. So that is why there is a link with monstrosity and disability. All right. So let's go to look at the slide number 1, and slide number 1 is talking about genealogy, right? Genealogy helps us uncover why we think as we do, or why we have come to perceive something in a particular way. This is asking a very fundamental question to us. This is asking a very pertinent question. Why do we think in a particular fashion? Why is it so that our thinking is programmed in a particular fashion? How it has become possible that we perceive something in a particular direction. So while genealogy tracks the evolution of an idea, history is focused on pinpointing origins. Look at the difference. There is a difference between genealogy and history. Genealogy tracks the evolution of an idea. History is more about pinpointing. History aims to establish a continuous trajectory for ideas, approaching them in a fixed, synchronous way and often aligning with the notion of eternal truth. Genealogy challenges the stability of any concept, favoring a path that reveals disruption and changes over time. Its purpose is to trace the break a concept experience. As Foucault explains, it was a matter not of digging down to a buried stratum of continuity, but of identifying the transformation which made this buried transition possible, this hurried transition possible. So here you see that what Foucault is more concerned, and that's how we can think about disability history. What Foucault is more concerned is looking at disruptions, the changes over time, how certain things got sedimented, what made certain things possible. These are the concern must be raised. It's not that what it is, how it became, what are the process got involved in making this happen, right? And this is why you see in this slide, that's talking about disruption, changes over time, right? The purpose is to trace the break of a concepts, buried stratum of a continuity, but of identifying the transformation which made this buried transition possible. So, until and unless we think about these, let's say, disruption, this is very important. And then changes, right? So, the point what genealogy does, right? Genealogy does not look at in the linear progression, but it look at the disruption. What has made this break and how we reach to a particular goal? How did you make this happen? That is what genealogy looks at, right? So, I am not going more into detail, but what my concern is that when you are looking at the disability history, don't look at the way history does, but the way genealogy made it possible. So, consider a concept like monstrosity, an idea introduced into a setting where labeling bodily differences as monstrous was not a cultural norm. This is not just about introducing the word or its synonymous. It's about the entire framework of ideas, such as morality, normalcy, and bodily ideals that sustain the concept of monstrosity. To highlight this shift across time and place, we will examine certain ideas and theories that is central to understanding Western disability history and explore how they have evolved within the Indian context. So, the point what I am trying to make you understand is that how monstrosity is connected with the morality, how monstrosity is connected with the normalcy, how monstrosity is connected with the bodily ideals. So, to think about monstrosity, you are not supposed to look at the monstrosity, you have to look at the normalcy, you have to look at the body ideals, you have to look at other framework of ideas, morality, right? So, if something that challenges the established notion of a morality, it becomes disability or monstrosity, right? So, one has to align with that moral concept. One has to follow that concept. So what disability poses a threat or a problem that it does not comply with. And since normative structure is so rigid, it doesn't allow anything to happen as well. So what it does, it makes it is aberration to the norm. And as we have already discussed, anything aberration falls under the category of disability or monstrosity. So colonization is very important because we have discussed in the previous class what colonial intervention did to us. So colonization affects cultures and consequently influences how people structure and interpret the world. A process described by Bal Gangadhara as colonial consciousness. Concepts are not isolated. They are within specific philosophical, intellectual and cultural landscape. This leads to the question, what kind of environment allows disability to exist as an idea encompassing philosophical, intellectual, linguistic and cultural dimensions? We can begin answering this by examining two key ideas, monstrosity and feeble-mindedness. So, Heathen in His Blindness is a book by Bal Gangadhara. I hope you will read that. And Reconceptualizing Indian Studies is another book by S. N. Bal Gangadhara. I am just recommending these books so that you can read them, but the point that I am making in this slide is this, that colonization has affected culture and also it has affected us. It has given a lens to interpret the world. So the lens is given by the colonization. So obviously, you will be interpreting the world through the lens of colonization. If yes, that is how the world will be produced. Because to think about the world, how to think about the world is given by the society, given by the colonial society, colonial administration. And if that is the case, we are going to interpret the society in that way. So this is the important point you need to understand. So there have been efforts within medicine and psychiatry to explore uniquely Indian forms of physical and mental differences, aiming to identify conditions specific to the culture. My focus is here on how ideas of monstrosity and feeble-mindedness emerged within medical discussion about India during the late 18th and 19th century. It is essential to remember that these concepts had established histories in Western thought long before they gained diagnostic status in medicine. How do categories developed in one cultural and epistemic framework adapt and retain their meaning in a different setting? This inquiry will ultimately challenge the new need divisions like medical, religious, social that have recently structured South Asian disability history and scholarship. So in this particular slide, there are some points that you need to get it, right? The first is 18th and 19th century, right? Why this time, this discourse emerged, 18th, 19th century. If you look back, this is a colonial time. This is the time where Britishers were expanding their colonies, and then this discussion emerged in the India. That's the first thing. What is the second thing that we need to keep in the mind? That the very discourse of monstrosity, very discourse of disability had already been discussed in the West. They have already come into the thought, Western thought. They were already taken the shape in Western thought. It's not that this discussion is emerging in India with people of India, from people of India, of people of India. This discussion has already emerged in the West. They have established histories in Western thought. So, we discussed that how one particular culture is influencing another culture, how colonial administration is reshaping this particular Indian ethos and culture. So, they are trying to challenge this, the way we think about health, the way we think about medicine. In fact, not challenge, but rather they are trying to reshape our thinking about health, medicine, body, society, so on and so forth. Right? So, this is why it becomes a very significant point to think. Exploring the history of monstrosity is relevant here, as Western studies on the genealogy of disability often highlight the significance of monstrous bodies. Investigating how the concept was received and applied in India during the early to mid-colonial period will shed light on its influence and adaptation. Additionally, Shah Daula's Chuhas are frequently cited as one of the earliest instances of religious institutional care for young adults. So, with cognitive disability in South Asian history, examining the conceptual framework and discursive landscape that enable this categorization offer valuable insight into historical positioning of disability. In Western history, the concept of monstrosity and the existence of monstrous bodies are often used to explain contemporary attitudes toward disabled people. Historical records from India, however, suggest that this linkage does not necessarily apply in the same way. In the West, social and theological perspective largely define monstrousness. Within Christian thought, a body deemed inhuman could also imply a moral or cosmic disruption. One example is the belief that monstrous bodies might symbolize an unnatural union between human and animal, breaching moral boundaries around sexuality. So, the notion of a monstrosity was deeply evaluative, shaped by dominant Christian values. Later on, obviously, Darwinian ideas added a significant rationale to monstrosity, shifting the concept toward a biological deviation from norms through societal revulsion toward such bodies persisted. Disability historians have used this history of monstrousness to help explain ongoing discriminatory attitudes toward disabled people in the Western context. If you remember, in the previous lectures I have already told that you can know the attitude of the people towards any particular community, class, culture, caste, so on and so forth, by picking a particular event. Here when we look at this particular event, what we find that somewhere religious inscriptions were responsible for discriminating people with disabilities. So, if a body is born differently or is a body marked with difference, they used to consider as if it is the union between, it's a union between animal and human. And therefore, obviously in the Western civilization, animals were treated very badly. They had a hierarchy, like the top hierarchy obviously God, and then human, then animal, then plant, and then other objects. So, there is a hierarchy was created, it's already there in the Western society. That's not in India. In India, it's not a difference between, if you look at the history, or if you look at the religion, or if you look at any particular folklores, historical records, archives, you will not see that there is a priority given to men or there is a priority given to certain set of being. Here, being were not significant at all, right? And that is why the very concept of a death and life is very different the way we think in India. However, the way they think in the West is very different. But the point is, since there is a hierarchy, obviously human cannot consider himself as an animal or any bodily resemblance with animal. And the entire human civilization was established based on discriminating animals, like this is what animals do. Right? In fact, when Descartes, when he's talking about cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, even there he's saying, he's making a difference between animal, but not in this sentence. What I mean to say that, obviously he's putting human as a conscious being who can think. He doesn't say animal can also think. Nowhere in his book Descartes is talking about that even animal can think. Obviously not. He nowhere suggests that. So, take this proposition for a second, that in the entire Western civilization, the idea of humanity and civilization is based on repression of animal or animal behavior or animal attitude, animal culture, so on and so forth. Right? And that is how they ruled over the British Indian as well, by saying that they are governed by emotions and instincts, not by intellect. So the discrimination was more based on they have a animal instinct, right? So let's not go into more detail, but the point what I'm trying to tell you that disabled people were considered as immoral, monstrous, because the category of monstrosity is not founded upon the body. It's more on deviation. It's more about what form of what you are deviating from the moral construct. It's not possible. You look like animal. And obviously later on we see that Darwinian concept or the science evolution has contributed a lot into this. But again, Darwinian is also influenced by Christian values. But I'm not teaching you Darwinism today, but what I'm trying to tell you that even Darwin ideas was inflected by Christian values. And then Darwin added a scientific rationale to monstrosity, shifting the concept toward a biological deviation from norms. Biological deviation through social revulsion towards such bodies, right? So it's like disability historians have used this history of monstrousness to help or explain ongoing discriminatory attitudes toward disabled people in Western context. So here you can see that how people with disabilities were discriminated in the West. The reason, the factor, the event, the context that are responsible for discrimination. So, monstrosity does not appear to be an intrinsic concept in Indian historical experience or framework for categorizing bodily differences, at least not without further evidence. Archival records suggest that monstrosity was introduced in India as a medical term rather than a theological or social. This is a very important, that here the body was never part of a theology, right? So, while scholarly journals of time discuss monstrous bodies in rational scientific terms, they retain some Western religious and social connotations, yet there is no corresponding evidence that these meanings were understood or accepted in India. So, two sources illustrate this difference: a letter published in Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society and a report in the Indian Medical Gazette, where they say that Edward Hume, a very famous British resident of India, described a double-headed child in Bengal who was taken around to collect alms. When the child died, he was buried according to local custom. Hume interpreted the act of carrying the child to collect money as a sign of social consciousness in his monstrousness, implying that child was viewed as repulsive, right? So, Hume is interpreting, that act of carrying the child to collect money is a sign of social consciousness on his monstrousness. So, however, we lack information about the social context of the child's life. Right? We have, like, he does not talk more about the family child belonged to and so on and so forth. Right? It seems like in India, it's not only who are disabled they beg, the people who are poor they also beg. In fact, even saints, priests also beg. Like, this is a very different idea of begging here. Right? But unfortunately, if we look at the Western context, here begging is associated with disability. Right? So, we lack information about the social context of the child's life. In the second case, recorded by Browning, a boy born with an extra set of limbs in Hyderabad in 1886 played freely despite his physical difference. In Europe, such cases might have led to their exhibition in freak shows, right, where their monstrous status would invite ridicule and amusement. So, Western disability historians often highlight such example to illustrate a tradition of social exclusion that informs present day attitudes toward disability. You got the idea? Right? This is what is talking about, that look at this. Europe is not like the treatment of child with the body with difference would have not been the same as it was in Hyderabad. You got it? Alright. So, we need to keep this in mind when we are working on it. So, these instances indicate that white Western history, like monstrosity to enduring social stigma around bodily differences, Indian historical responses to similar differences may not fit this pattern. If we consider that social attitudes toward a person with unusual physical feature determine whether they are seen as a monstrous, then in the case of the boy in Hyderabad, this concept of monstrosity does not apply in the Western sense. His physical difference may have been understood through other context-specific ideas and values. Through these remain clear, though these remain is not sure, available documentation does not reveal alternative perspectives on bodily difference. Instead, it employs terms that steer our interpretation in specific direction. To illustrate this further, we can examine the example of Sadhu's rights, commonly cited in literature as an early example of Indian feeble-mindedness. Colonial records describe rat-like people at the shrine of Sadhua in Punjab during the 19th century. Depending on the author's time period in the field, these accounts suggest different interpretations. So, the presence of rat-like people, I mean, you can read this, I am not going to talk more in detail, but the point what I am trying to talk about is both the colonial writer here in the end, right, Miles drew upon local hearsay about the shrine and the saint, which included various popular belief, right. So, in the 1980s, there is a scholar in psychiatry and psychology, they were using colonial account to argue for this cultural specific form of mental illness. But there are many interpretations that we see, there are many popular beliefs about this, right. So, Sadhua was seen as a saint who showed kindness to both humans and animals, including those with animal-like qualities, right. Look at this. Even there was acceptance to people who showed animal-like qualities. So, truly to understand Indian approaches to the bodily and intellectual differences, we need to analyze the language and rhetoric that is circulated in these local stories. It's important to know that this would provide insight into how cultural framework classify and respond to corporeal and cognitive diversity rather than relying solely on externally imposed categories. So, this is what I was trying to explain to you, that when we are looking at people with disabilities, when we are examining the history of disability in India, when we are going deep into know how disability was treated in the past and how we have reached to the point where we are, we have to look at not the categories given to us by the outside, but rather we need to look at the categories inside, look at the different interpretation, look at the local cultures, the way it is interpreted. We have to do the proper ethnography. We have to go and look at the different thinking pattern interpretations available. If as an outsider we will look at it and analyze it, it will be really injustice. The kind of framework we have already given the framework by the Western and colonial administrations, right? Colonial knowledge has given us the kind of a framework. If that framework we apply, we are going to misinterpret. We are not going to understand the culture, the treatment with bodily differences. So with this, I would like to end my lecture here, and we'll start the new module in the next lecture. Thank you so much.